Hello, and welcome to CRPS Contender, my complex regional pain syndrome education channel. Today we are taking part 3 of the journal journey of Neuropsychological Changes in CRPS. This paper was published in January of 2020 in Chronic Pain Hurts the Brain, the Pain Physician's Perspective. Just as a quick refresher, let's read from the abstract here. CRPS is a poorly understood chronic pain condition of multifactorial origin. CRPS involves sensory, motor, and autonomic symptoms, as well as reduced attention to CRPS-affected extremities, reminiscent of hemispatial neglect. However, this neglect-like framework is not sufficient to characterize the range of higher cognitive functions that can be altered in CRPS. This comprehensive literature review synthesizes evidence of neuropsychological changes in CRPS in the context of potential central mechanisms of the disorder, constituting 3 distinct but not independent groups: distorted body representation, deficits in lateralized spatial cognition, and impairment of non-spatially-lateralized higher cognitive functions, consistent with a broader disruption to parietal function beyond merely what could be considered neglect-like. And today we will be focused on the third of these 3 groups, impairment of non-spatially-lateralized higher cognitive functions. Quick intro to the way that they were doing this meta-analysis. Hemispatial neglect is reduced awareness of stimuli on one side of space, even though there may be no sensory loss. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that despite the absence of brain lesions, people with CRPS can present with neuropsychological symptoms. This article provides a comprehensive, critical review of the evidence for altered neuropsychological functions in CRPS. The authors conducted a literature search using the PubMed database for articles including keywords regarding complex regional pain syndrome published in English between 1995 and 2019. They limited the scope of this review to adults and concluded that the currently used neglect-like framework is insufficient for characterizing the variety of neuropsychological changes shown by people with CRPS, and they advocate the role of parietal cortical networks in the emergence of these symptoms. In previous parts of this series, we have learned that people with CRPS deal with distorted body representation and deficits in lateralized spatial cognition. However, people with CRPS can also present with cognitive deficits that are not lateralized with respect to the affected side of body or space. Potentially affected aspects of non-spatially lateralized spatial cognition include spatial orientation, where you are in space in relation to other objects; memory for spatial locations, such as where you put your keys down or how to get to the grocery store; visuospatial exploration and coordination, where other objects are in space; constructional abilities, your ability to draw or copy or think about 3D objects or lines or shapes; and knowledge about the orientation and order of objects, letters, or numbers. Potentially affected aspects of non-spatially lateralized non-spatial cognition include numerical and language processing, recognition of objects and faces, imitating complex movements, generalized attention, working memory, and executive function. Broadly speaking, these can be broken into cognitive functions that have been associated with the parietal lobe and frontal functions, memory, and language. Comprehensive, standard neuropsychological assessments of people with CRPS revealed no systematic abnormalities. However, studies have found that 68% of tested participants with CRPS showed one or more deficit in their ability to recognize objects by touch, identify the fingers of the hand, identify numbers outlined on the surface of the hand, draw objects, comprehend arithmetic, write, repeat speech, and differentiate between the left and right side of the body, and or imitate gestures or tool use. This suggests that these symptoms could be due to CRPS-related functional cortical reorganization of the parietal networks. Studies directly assessing parietal lobe function in CRPS have thus far had relatively small sample sizes and usually lack pain or age-matched control groups. Therefore, it's difficult to estimate the real prevalence of these symptoms. reports of deficits in CRPS that are typical of patients with temporal and parietal lesions suggest a disruption of the visual spatial functions that could be due to functional cortical reorganization in these areas. People with CRPS did have poor temporal acuity when making spatial judgments. In a visual temporal order judgment task, CRPS patients needed larger intervals between the two stimuli to reliably indicate their order of presentation. 42% of people with CRPS presented with mild dysexecutive syndrome, and 23% of people with CRPS showed global cognitive processing impairments. Besides executive deficits, they also demonstrated impaired naming and declarative memory. I did my previous video on this paper. I've titled it Dysexecutive Syndrome. You can go find it in the Journal Journey playlist. Executive, naming, and memory deficits are consistent with pathology of the frontal lobes. Together with the deficits in general spatial cognition, problems with language processing also suggest changes to parietal functions in CRPS. In summary, people with CRPS can present with non-spatially-lateralized deficits in higher cognition that resemble impairments found in neurological conditions other than hemispatial neglect. Findings from standard neuropsychological test batteries are still mixed. Unusual symptoms appear to affect only a subset of people with CRPS, yet they demonstrate that changes in the visual spatial functions are not limited to lateralized spatial processing biases. People with CRPS can also present with features of dysexecutive syndrome and some language processing difficulties that are typical of frontal and parietal lobe pathology. These changes include impaired sustained attention, impaired selective attention, a tendency to favor local features over global configurations. In the saying, you lose the forest for the trees, the forest would be the global configuration, and the trees would be the local features. And deficits in spatial working memory, such as remembering where things are in space after a short period of time. Evidence suggests that the neglect framework is useful, but not sufficient, for characterizing the breadth of neuropsychological changes in CRPS. But a disruption of the parietal function and/or cortical networks involving the parietal lobe appears to be a better candidate. The next video will be talking about the clinical relevance and the conclusion of this paper. If you would like to contribute to my living expenses, my Patreon is CRPS Contender. Thank you to my loyal patrons, Chase and Emily Malcontent. If you'd like to see the paper for yourself, it's linked in the description, as are the notes and the slides used in these presentations. If you like what I'm doing here, please like and subscribe to let YouTube know that you like what I'm making on this channel. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something today, and I hope to see you next time.